Welcome to the walkthrough of Assignment 4's frequently made mistakes. First, as always, please make sure you document your code thoroughly. It's not sufficient just to write code. You have to explain what you think you're doing. That will help me provide better comments and help you understand why you're doing what you're doing so we can make things work properly. Let's take a look at some problems here. The first problem is with the initialization of the M0 field. Using supply async in this manner is overkill. Instead, please use a completable future method that has no runtime overhead whatsoever. We don't need to do something that runs in a background thread like we're doing here. Let's take a look at a problem with perform crawl. Most people got perform crawl right, but there's no need to be using supply async here. Please read the specification comments carefully, and also there's no need to use the get now method. Both of those things are unnecessary. It's much simpler to do this than what you're seeing here. Let's take a look at some problems with crawl page async. This implementation doesn't match the specification comment that was above that says to use a sequential stream, so please refactor the code to do that. Here's another problem. Make sure you don't use get anywhere. I'll note this down below with other comments. You should not be using the get method at all. Likewise, you should only have one call to the join method. There's a bunch of mistakes below where people are using get and join all over the place, which is incorrect. Don't use get here, use or else, where it returns a value if the return is not present, if the value that comes back from find first is not present. Let's take a look at some problems with crawl page helper. This particular implementation needs to use the helper methods that are defined later on in the file, rather than making all the calls in line, so don't do it like this. Don't be making calls to supply async here. There's one call here, and there's one call here. Those should not be done. Instead, we should be getting the page asynchronously and storing that in a completable future and then using that in the parameters that are passed to the helper methods. Likewise, don't be calling get now. There should be no use of get now anywhere in any of the code. Here's another problem that a lot of people did. Make sure you add 1 to the depth parameter when you call it here in crawl page helper. That'll prevent you from getting a weird error message from the regression tests. Let's take a look at get page async. This code doesn't conform to the specification comment that's above in the skeleton since it's not asynchronous. That's a synchronous call. You want an asynchronous call, so make sure you use the proper factor method to make the call run asynchronously. Here's an example where there's an unnecessary local variable. Just go ahead and return the results. Don't store it locally and then return the local variable. Let's take a look at get images on page async. A bunch of problems here. First, supply async isn't a completion stage method, so make sure you read the specification comment carefully and replace supply async with the proper completion stage method. If you do this right, you don't need a try catch block, which makes your code much more efficient looking and concise. You also should not be using .get anywhere in your solution at all, and likewise only one call to join. Instead, use completion stage methods to get the right result here. This code makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, creating a new array list and then adding an element to it. I don't understand what that's trying to do, but if you fix the code above, you won't need to use this particular implementation. Let's take a look at other get images on page async problems. This particular call here using then apply is the wrong completion stage method to use. You need to think more carefully about how to avoid nesting of futures. We talked about nested completable futures and how to avoid those using the right completion stage method. So please go back and watch the video that talks about that. And again, there should be no need for using get now. If you use the right completion stage method, you don't need to use get now. Down here's got some other problems. Don't use join, never use join. There's only one use of join, and that's in the perform crawl method way above. So don't be using that, and use the appropriate completion stage method here to get the right result. So there's a bunch of problems with this code. Here's yet some more problems. This particular implementation doesn't fulfill the specification comments above. If you take a look, you'll see why, but read the specification comments carefully and apply the right completion stage method. And you should not be using join here. There's no need to use join. I don't even think this code will compile because it's supposed to return a completable future. Also, make sure that you're compiling your code and make sure that you're running the tests. There's lots and lots of problems here that will be flagged by compilation and running the tests. This implementation also is another problem with get images on page async. Don't be using supply async. Don't be using join. Don't be using join here. Lots and lots and lots of problems with this code. Now let's move on to crawl hyperlinks on page async. This is calling the wrong completion stage method, so go back and look carefully at what you need to do. I'm not quite sure what this is supposed to be doing, but it's incorrect. There's no need to use new incomplete future. I'm not really even sure what that does, but it doesn't do the right thing. Again, don't be using join here. Make sure that you use the right completion stage method as described in the comments. And here we have crawl hyperlinks on page, some more problems. Don't use then apply with i.count. I'm not quite sure what is intended there, but you need to use the sum method on intstream in order to be able to get the right results back from this. Let's take a look at some problems with combined results. This is actually a pretty simple method, but you should make sure that you use a completion stage method instead of using completed future. And once again, under no circumstances should you be calling join in methods like this. Like I said, join only goes one place at the very beginning. It doesn't belong anywhere else. Completely defeats the purpose of using completable futures if you use join. And please make sure you use a method reference here instead of a lambda expression. So this code should not be using a lambda expression. It should be using the appropriate method reference instead. Don't increment depth here. That should be done in a different part of the code much earlier, I think in crawl page helper perhaps. And I'm not sure what's trying to go on here, but this is definitely incorrect. You shouldn't be calling get page elements. Instead, you should be using the intstream sum method to do this computation. Let's take a look at crawl hyperlinks on page. There's no need to use supply async here. There's no need to increment depth here. The parameter that's being passed here is incorrect, and get is being used. Don't use get. Instead, use intstream sum. And there's no need for a try catch block if you do everything properly because you won't be using get. Don't use join either. Don't use join or get. Let's take a look at some more problems with get hyperlinks on page. You don't need to call filter here to filter out nulls because there should be no nulls. You don't need to increment depth by 1 here. That should be moved up to crawl page helper. And please use a method reference here instead of a lambda expression. Just a good habit to get into. Your compiler should give you a diagnostic that indicates you should do that, and it'll also help you make that change. Down here, there's no need to use reduce. Instead, use intstream sum, as we've talked about before. You don't need to use supply async here in process images. This is also crawling the wrong intermediate operation here because you're getting back a stream of these things, and you need to basically make sure you flatten them properly. And this is the wrong terminal operation to use. Please see the specification comments above for some hints on what to do here. Let's take a look at process images. Some more problems there. You should be using map here instead of flat map for this particular call, but make sure you use a method reference and not a lambda expression. Also, make sure you use flat map here instead of then apply async. That'll get you a better result. Yet some more problems with process images. Lots of problems with process images. Please don't be using supply async here. This is very confusing and unnecessary. So you should be using something else besides this, and you should be using get or download image async in conjunction with the map call before you use transform image async, which this whole code needs to be quite a bit refactored to do it correctly. And make sure that you pass the right parameter to then apply. You need to sum the results of the elements in the int stream, which is what is coming back here from the call I've omitted. And then let's go take a look at a problem with transform image async. Please take a look at the Piazza discussion to see how to refactor this code. This code is just incorrect in a lot of different ways. You shouldn't be starting with then apply async. Instead, you should be using mtransforms, and there's just a lot of problems with this code. This code here definitely needs to be improved. So please think about that, read the specification comments, and as always, let me know if you have any questions, post any questions you have to Piazza. This particular assignment probably had the most mistakes of any of the ones we've done thus far. So I assume that that's because completable futures are a little bit trickier than things like streams and parallel streams, or even the fork join pool for that matter. So please make sure you go back and rewatch those videos and think carefully about what we're doing and ask questions.